Hey guys, it's Chris. So I've been talking about this video for a while now, and there's been a pretty decent amount of interest in it, which has made me really happy, and I decided I just really wanted to get it out as soon as possible. This is going to be a video all about Stephen King books, specifically all about the books that I have read by Stephen King. Usually in my videos I cut out the parts where I look at my notes to make sure I'm on track, but this time I might be looking at my notes. I hope that doesn't bother too many people, but I just really don't want to forget anything, and I don't want to leave anything out. And I just want to make sure I say everything that I wanted to say about each book. So like I said, this specifically is going to be about the books by Stephen King that I have read. Now, Stephen King has written 55 novels, soon to be 57, and I'll talk about that a little bit towards the end. But of those 55, I have read 25. He's published 9 collections of short stories and novellas, and I've read 7 of those. He's written a few nonfiction books, and I've read 2 of those. So I have not read everything by Stephen King, so I by no means consider myself to be a Stephen King expert. Not at all. I really feel like I can say at least a few things about each of the Stephen King books that I've read and possibly give recommendations to people who may not have read anything by him before, or who are not sure what to read by him, not sure if they'd really like his writing, not sure if they'd really like the horror genre. I'm basically here to tell you that he writes in a lot of different genres than horror, and I want to give you recommendations based on what each book is about, what the genre of each book is, what I believe the genre of each book is, and I'll kind of give recommendations to people that I think would like each book. So whether this is going to be your first Stephen King book, or you're just not sure which Stephen King book to pick up next, or you're maybe iffy about a Stephen King book you've read in the past, not sure if you liked it that much, you may be able to find something now that maybe suits what you like better. Because he's written so many books that it's difficult for a lot of people probably to like everything that he's written. I usually like everything he's written because I really like his style, and I like a lot of different genres. And I just wanted to give a little look into what certain Stephen King books are about and what ones I think you should read. So I'm going to go in chronological order of when the books are published. I'm going to be starting with his earliest work to his most recent work, with just a few exceptions. I'm going to skip over the Dark Tower series until after talking about all of the standalone books that I've read. The Dark Tower series, the first one was published in 1982, and the last one was published, the 8th one was published 2012. It was published in 2012, so that's 30 years, and I don't really want to talk about them individually as we get through them in the chronological order. I just want to talk about them all at once, and I'm going to tell you right now that I haven't finished the Dark Tower series, and I'll get to why that is when I get to it. I plan on finishing it this year, just so you know, but I'll get to it when I get to it. Another thing is his collections of short stories and novellas. I'm going to do those separately as well, but once I get to those, I'll talk about them in chronological order. But I'm not going to talk about them in this first list of just novels. I'm also going to be talking about the 2 nonfiction books that I've read by him separately as well. So without further ado, let's get started. I'll try not to spend way too much time on each book, but we'll see how it goes. Ready? So the first book that Stephen King ever had published is published in 1974, and it's Carrie. A lot of people have probably heard about Carrie. It's been made into 3 movies, I think, with the first movie definitely being the best one. But this is the first book that Stephen King ever had published. It's not the first book that he ever wrote, but it's the first book that he ever had published. And you can kind of tell why it was probably picked up to be published, why it would have appealed to publishers is what I mean. Because I think publishers probably realized that it appealed to both adults and teens alike, because it has a lot of twisted, creepy horror stuff going on, but it also can really appeal to teens. I'm pretty sure it's the only book where the main character is a teenage girl, or just anyone in high school. I can definitely see why publishers would have thought this book would be appealing to a big audience, and why it was his first successful book to be published. It's basically about a girl who gets shat on by everyone in her entire life. Her mother is a religious, crazy person who is terrifying, and everyone that's at her high school just treats her like a piece of crap, and she basically just feels worthless. And then some pretty screwed up stuff happens to her in the story. And it's a really short read. This is actually, it's a pretty quick read. It's a really exciting read, but Carrie basically has these telekinetic powers, which definitely makes for a very interesting experience for her. And it's really disturbingly satisfying to see how she handles the people that screw with her in her life. I won't try to say too much about that, but I would definitely recommend this book to anyone that is a fan of like young adult fiction. This is not necessarily young adult fiction at all, but I think it's the closest to young adult fiction that Stephen King has ever got. The most appealing to people that are still in high school. And like I said, it's a really quick read, and you should definitely give it a shot if any of that sounds interesting to you. The second book that Stephen King had published, which was published in 1975, was Salem's Lot, which is actually the first book that I ever read by Stephen King, which I loved, and which made me fall in love with Stephen King and set me on this path of reading tons of Stephen King books. This is like intense horror. It's vampires, and it's really, really great. I really love this book so much. If you think vampires are fun to read about, then you should definitely pick this book up. This is like what I would perceive to be like a classic vampire book at this point, because it's just got so many great elements of classic vampire in it, and Stephen King adds his own little twist to it, and it's just really, really great. Now, this isn't like Twilight or Vampire Academy vampires. This is like a really intense horror vampire story, and especially towards the end, there's so much intense stuff going on. It's so quick and fast paced. It's like really, really gripping, really thrilling, and if that sounds interesting to you, definitely check that out. The third book that Stephen King ever had published was one that most people have heard of, The Shining. It was published in 1977. A lot of people have seen the movie by Stanley Kubrick, which if you have seen that movie and you haven't read the book, I definitely suggest you read the book, because the book is a lot better. Stanley Kubrick is a great filmmaker, and that movie is great for its own reasons, but it's a completely different type of story, and the Stephen King book is a million times scarier. And honestly, if I had to pick one book that Stephen King will be remembered by in like 100 years from now, then The Shining would be it. The Shining is just a great horror novel about this family, this guy named Jack, his wife Wendy, and their son Danny. They have to stay at this hotel called the Overlook Hotel, and the hotel is just like this really creepy, really scary place that just has all of these like memories and ghostly, scary things just like seeping through the walls. And the title refers to this ability that Danny has where he can kind of communicate with other people like through his mind, but also he kind of gets little hints of the memories of ghosts that are lingering around the Overlook Hotel. And it's hinted at that his father Jack kind of has this ability too, and Jack is kind of an alcoholic and kind of succumbing to the Overlook's influence. And it's really creepy, it's really great, it's really psychological. Stephen King is the way he describes this addiction that Jack feels is really, really great. It's really, really gripping, and like I said, it's just a classic horror book. And if you really love horror and you have not read The Shining, then you definitely need to. Those first three books that he had published, in my opinion, is what really established him in the horror genre. The next book is called The Stand, and it came out in 1978. Now, if there's one word I can use to describe this book, it's epic. Stephen King talked about how he really wanted to do this like epic fantasy type of thing, kind of like inspired by Lord of the Rings. He really wanted to do something like that. And now he didn't really write that for The Stand. The Stand is not a fantasy book at all. Basically, it's about the United States government has basically created a weaponized flu that kind of spreads really fast and just pretty much destroys everyone. And there's only a few survivors left, so this book is like post-apocalyptic, but it's like an epic post-apocalyptic book that deals with surviving. And there's this colony of like survivors. There's a few colonies of survivors, and this is the introduction to a character, an antagonist that Stephen King uses in a few of his other works, called Randall Flagg. He was really sinister. He's kind of supernatural. The book does have some supernatural elements to it as well, and a lot of it deals with like this kind of battle between these two surviving groups, one of them that's led by this antagonist named Randall Flagg. And if a post-apocalyptic epic sounds appealing to you, then this is definitely something you should read. It's really long, it's like over 1,000 pages. It's been revised a few times, and the newest revision is over 1,000 pages long. Actually, I just realized I haven't been showing you any of the copies of the books that I have, but this is the Stand copy that I have, and it is very massive. The writing is really small. It's very much something you really have to immerse yourself into, but if that's something that sounds like something that's interesting to you, then you should definitely check this out. It's been considered one of his best books, and I would definitely agree with that. It has a crap load of characters in it, and it has a crap load of stuff going on in it, and it's just a huge undertaking, but it's really great. The next book, which was published in 1979, is called The Dead Zone, and I would consider this to be a horror book. This is it right here. This is a pretty quick read. This is a book that I would say is a fast read. Some of King's books are a little bit difficult to get into at first because they start off a little bit slow. But this book, I felt like it was exciting from beginning to end. It basically is about this guy named Johnny who gets into an accident and he's in a coma for like 5 years, and he wakes up from the coma and he kind of has these psychic powers. Basically, he can kind of sense what is going to happen to people or things if he like touches them. He uses this kind of like for political reasons, and I would say that this book has a lot of political things in it. So if political sounds really interesting to you, this is like definitely horror, but also thriller. So if like political thriller / horror sounds interesting to you, definitely give The Dead Zone a shot. It's really gripping and it's not very long at all compared to a lot of his other books. The next book is called Firestarter, and it was published in 1980. I would not consider this book to be horror. I would say it's more of a thriller and has some elements of sci-fi. And it's basically about this guy. He and his wife kind of went into this like drug testing program, and that one of United States government agencies was like doing, and it kind of gave them these like telepathic like abilities, and they have a daughter who, as their offspring, gets these really interesting abilities. She basically like becomes pyrokinetic, I think that's what it's called, but she can like do stuff with fire, and that's why it's called Firestarter. I would say that this book was actually one of the slowest books that I've ever read by him. It picked up a lot as it went on, and it's pretty short, so I guess you can get kind of through the slow parts pretty fast. But like I will probably say in a few other talks about these books, Stephen King kind of uses a lot of backstory sometimes and a lot of flashbacks, and a lot of this book is told in flashbacks, and a lot of it kind of deals with like really strange science-y type of things. That's the best way I can describe it, but it's still good. It has a really great ending, and I would say it's one of his more underrated books, even though it is pretty difficult for me personally to get into. It's still really good. The next book is one that I actually don't have a copy of. It's called The Talisman. It was written in 1984 with Peter Straub. He is another horror writer, another writer that at the time and still now today kind of like on par with Stephen King. They were like considered two of the best horror writers, and when it was found out that they were doing this collaboration together, the world was expecting like this huge, awesome, like the most perfect horror novel ever written, and they wrote a really good book, but it is not horror. They kind of surprised everybody by doing that. Basically, it's about this kid named Jack Sawyer who kind of sets off on this journey to find this thing called the Talisman, which he thinks will save his mother who is dying. And as he's like going on this little journey, he kind of ends up in this place called the Territories, and it's kind of revealed that everyone has something called a twinner in the Territories. A twinner is kind of what it sounds like. It's basically a mirror of everyone. So everyone has a mirrored personality in the Territories, and all of the life events that you have are paralleled by the life events that your twinner has. And it's a really interesting concept. It's a really great concept. It's not horror. It has a lot of elements of fantasy. It makes a lot of connections to his Dark Tower series, kind of indirectly, but it is a really great story. I mean, it does have some elements of horror, but when something like this has so many elements of fantasy to it, I would more consider it to be dark fantasy than horror. And I would definitely say this is dark fantasy. If you like fantasy, this is a great book. This book actually has a sequel called Black House, and I'll talk about that when I get to it. Came out many years later. It's also really good, but it's very different. So you could just read The Talisman as like the standalone fantasy book, and I think you would really like it if you like fantasy. Next book was published in 1987, and it is called Misery. Here it is. It's kind of, my copy is a little bit messed up because I've read it actually a few times. This is a really quick read. This is exciting from beginning to end. This book is so much fun. If you've ever seen the movie, then the book is very similar, but the book, of course the book is better, but the movie is great as well. It's really enjoyable. It's basically about this writer who gets in an accident and then is kind of saved by his like #1 fan, and the #1 fan is kind of insane. Her name is Annie, and she is one of the greatest Stephen King characters of all time. She is one of the most enjoyable characters to read about. This is one of the most enjoyable, short, exciting books that Stephen King has written, and I really, really recommend this to anyone. I would definitely say this is horror, but I would also definitely recommend this to anyone that is even just a writer. Maybe not, you don't like horror necessarily, but it's just a really exciting read to imagine as a writer. It's horrifying if you imagine yourself as a writer and having anything like this happen to you. Yeah, it's really good, and this is definitely one that I would recommend to pretty much anyone. I mean, if you're not sure if you like horror, the horror in this is not so overbearing that it kind of takes everything. This is really just fun. It's like fun horror, and it's great, and I definitely recommend it. The next book is called The Dark Half, and it was published in 1989. I actually just read The Dark Half this past year in 2013. This book deals with, if you didn't know, Stephen King wrote several books towards the beginning of his career under the name Richard Bachman to kind of he started doing that right after he published the first 3 books that he wrote to kind of get a gauge for how people would react to his work without his name on it, and so he could write work that was a little bit different. But it was eventually found out that he was Richard Bachman, and this kind of deals with that a little bit. This deals with a writer that has a pseudonym that kind of comes to life, and this is definitely horror. This is dark horror. The antagonist, the writer's pseudonym, is one screwed up, messed up guy who just is completely black-hearted and takes absolutely no prisoners whatsoever. It's really gripping. I really think even if you don't like horror, I mean, this is definitely a horror book, but it could appeal to writers as well, because Stephen King talks a lot about the writing process in this. He kind of describes what writers have as a third eye that's in their brain that kind of sees things that other people don't see, that allows them to create these whole worlds in these books and stuff. And I thought it was really great. But like I said, this is definitely horror. And so if you're into horror, and especially if you're a writer, then I definitely suggest you read this. The next book is called Needful Things. It was published in 1991. This is another book that I just had a lot of fun reading. There are a lot of really, really great characters in this book. It's basically about this shop that opens in a town called Castle Rock. This is actually the same town that the last book I just talked about, The Dark Half, takes place in, and actually has a couple of the same characters that The Dark Half has, which is really nice to see. But basically the shop called Needful Things opens in this town, and when you go into it, it basically has something for everyone. Literally, you go in and you will find something that you want or that you need, and it's run by another really, really great Stephen King character who is also the villain, and he is just really fun to read about. I would definitely say this book is horror. I wouldn't say it's really scary horror, but it's definitely a type of horror, but I would say it's a type of thriller, and I really love the beginning of this book. The beginning really gripped me, and I was really just taken for a ride from beginning to end in this book, and I really think it's one of his funner books to read. And I also think it's a little bit underrated, but that's just my opinion. I really like this book a lot. It was one of the first books I read by him, actually. And I would say if you love great villains, you should definitely check this out. Really sinister and really charming, but relentless and screwed up villains, then you should definitely check this out because it's really great and the villain is really great. The next book is actually the only Richard Bachman book that I have ever read, and it's called The Regulators. This actually has a mirror novel, like a companion novel called Desperation. This book was kind of put out being by Richard Bachman, and Desperation was put out being by Stephen King, but they're mirrors of each other. I have not read Desperation, so I can't talk too much about that, but I will tell you a little bit about what this book is about. I would not say this book is necessarily horror. It has some elements of sci-fi, but it also has some elements of spaghetti western. Basically, it starts out on this street, and this is a book where Stephen King just shines with creating characters. He basically creates this whole street of characters and kind of relates them all to each other in some way. And then there's this autistic boy who kind of gets this ability to control reality with his mind, and he kind of changes everything on the street to fit what he sees in a television show that's kind of like a western. So the book has a lot of spaghetti western elements into it, and it basically, the entire street just has to deal with what this autistic boy is turning reality into on the street. And it's really great. It's exciting from beginning to end for me. At least this was not a book that is difficult to get into at all. And I really think I might want to try to read Desperation sometime this year. I think I'll have to reread this stuff. I don't remember everything about this book, but all I remember is really loving it. This next book is called Bag of Bones. This was written in 1998, and I would definitely say this is a horror book, but it also has a lot of other stuff in it too. It's basically about this writer named Mike. He's a pretty, in this story, he's a pretty famous writer, and his wife has just died, but he keeps having all of these like weird dreams and weird nightmares about this summer house they go to sometimes in this really, really small town. And to kind of like figure out what's going on, he goes to this small town and lives in this house. The house is called Sarah Laughs. It has a name, Sarah Laughs. And in this house, there's just like a whole bunch of crazy stuff going on. But at the same time, Mike kind of becomes involved with some other stuff. There's this girl named Maddie, and she has a really young child. And basically, Maddie is fighting for custody over her child with the child's grandfather, who is like the richest person in town. He has a ton of influence over everybody in the town, and basically everybody in the town loves him and thinks Maddie is like trash, and Maddie is really trying to not let her child see the grandfather at all because she feels like it won't be good for her. So Mike kind of becomes involved with this, and being like kind of wealthy himself from being a writer, he kind of helps her out financially, and there's just this really nice kind of relationship building between them. And I would definitely say this book has a lot of like little romance elements to it, while at the same time having a lot of horror elements to it. And it's also just really thrilling, so I would say it's a thriller as well. And it just has a lot of really, really great elements to it. And I put on my notes that this is a transition-y type of book, and what I mean by that is that this is kind of where I would see a transition from Stephen King's like older writing to his newer writing. His older writing just has this really distinct style, and his newer writing just has this really distinct style. And I would say that this book is kind of like a transition in between those two. And it's really hard to explain what I mean by that, but I find this book to be really enjoyable. It's a pretty thick book. It's pretty long, but it's really easy to get into. And if you like horror, and if you like the idea of a mix between like horror aspects and romance aspects and thriller aspects, then I definitely suggest this one. And then I just had a quick note before the next book, because in between that book and the next book I'm going to talk about, he had an accident where he was hit by a car and kind of hospitalized for a while on June 19th, 1999. Actually, he was hit by a tractor trailer, and he almost kind of gave up writing after this, but then he like decided not to. But he was kind of coming close to retiring. He kind of has this label of being a horror writer. In my opinion, after this accident, he kind of just does whatever stories that he wants to do, and I think it has some really great results a lot of the time. The next book I'm going to talk about is Black House, which is the sequel to The Talisman, which is also written with Peter Straub. Now, The Talisman was like, everybody was expecting to be this awesome like horror novel, and instead it was an awesome fantasy novel. But then this book kind of strays away from that. I would not say this is fantasy. This is not a usual sequel that you would see to a book. This is a very strange sequel, and I would definitely say it's horror and not fantasy, although it does still retain some of the aspects that The Talisman had. This mainly takes place in real life, and I would definitely use that to consider it a horror book. Basically, it's about Jack Sawyer, who is now grown up, and he's kind of repressed what has happened in The Talisman. He's kind of forgotten a lot about it, and now he's like this cop slash kind of like detective, but he just solves all of these like mysteries. He's really, really good at doing that, and he's kind of called into this one town to help solve a mystery, a child murder mystery, and the murderer has been like dubbed this name called the Fisherman, and it's told in a really, really unique way. I actually wrote a full review on this book when I read it last year, actually in 2013. It's got so many great things about it. The way it's written is just so different, and you can tell that Peter Straub and Stephen King were both having so much fun writing this. Just like one of the perspectives you get is just like from a bird. Things that are happening are being described from the perspective of like a bird that's like flying over everything. You kind of see everything that happens from this big wide angle lens. They kind of give you everything that's happening, and they basically speak to the audience, the reader, a lot of the time, and tell them what's happening before the characters actually know what's happening. So you kind of like are on the edge of your seat because you know what's happening, but the character is completely oblivious, and it makes for such like a suspenseful and really great reading experience. And I would definitely suggest this to you if that sounds interesting to you. I would definitely say this is horror, although if you read The Talisman and you really liked it and you haven't read this, I would definitely suggest you pick it up, but also understand that it's definitely a lot different. The main character, Jack, is still just as great as before, and all of the other characters that are introduced in this are also really great. And even though it's long, I was excited and enthralled throughout the entire thing. The next book I'm going to talk about is called Cell, and it was published in 2006. This is good. It's definitely gets your attention right from the get-go. This is not a book that is slow to start. This is a zombie book. I mean, that's the best way you can describe it, is zombie. I mean, if you like things like The Walking Dead or the video game The Last of Us or World War Z or just anything like that, then I definitely think you would like this book. It's a really interesting zombie concept. I would definitely consider it horror, but also it's just got a lot of the zombie elements to it, and I would call it a thriller as well. I mean, it's got a really dark beginning that really just pulls you right in to the story, like, immediately. It doesn't waste any time getting you into the story. And the story itself is good. I really like the main character. It's not one of my favorite Stephen King books. I think the ending was a little weird for me. A lot of the parts were kind of weird for me, but that's just my opinion. I'm honestly not really into zombie stuff. The only thing that I've seen or partaked in recently that had zombies in it that I really liked was the video game The Last of Us. But generally I don't really like things that involve zombies. I do like the movie I Am Legend. I just got the book I Am Legend. I'm really excited to read that. But I would definitely put this up there with zombie stuff, and if you like zombie stuff, then you should definitely check this out. The next book I have talked about a few times in my videos and have referred to it repeatedly as my favorite Stephen King book. It was published in 2008, and that is Lizzie's Story. Now, this is a book that I can definitely tell you is not horror, and I honestly think it's so much different than anything Stephen King has ever wrote, but still with his like really great style. I think this is like the epitome of his writing style. It's beautifully written. So much of the stuff that happens in the book is just beautifully put together and beautifully thought out. And I've heard before that Stephen King said that this is one of his favorite books that he's ever wrote, and I can like feel that when I read it personally. I can feel the love that was put into this book. I would call this book a romance book with a lot of fantasy elements to it, and I'm going to tell you right now that it is kind of difficult to get into at first. It is told heavily through flashbacks. It's basically about this girl named Lizzie Landon, who her husband was a famous writer and he died, and she's kind of remembering a whole bunch of stuff about their relationship, and there are these like scholars out there who are trying to get their hands on things that her husband Scott wrote that was never published, and she's dealing with that while at the same time remembering all these things about her relationship with Scott. And just this, it creates this beautiful like language between them, this world between them that only exists between them, and I think it's a really, really great look at relationships and at marriages and why they can be really beautiful things, how they can create whole universes around just two people, and what inhabits those universes between those two people, the language that inhabits it, the dark things that inhabits it, the secrets, and just everything. There's not enough that I could say about this book to praise it enough. I know that I'm kind of alone for the most part, and being my favorite Stephen King book, at least I think I am anyway. A lot of people tend to like his horror stuff more, and this is very far from that in my opinion, and that's kind of what makes it so great for me personally. And if that sounds appealing to you at all, if you think you'd enjoy that as much as I did, just know that the beginning is a little bit difficult to get into. It's kind of slow to start off, and I understand that, but definitely keep going through, give it a shot, and I think you'll really come out feeling like you just experienced something really, really unique and really, really beautiful. At least I hope that's how you'll feel anyway. And I couldn't recommend this book enough. The next book is called Doom a Key. This is a weird book. This book was published in 2008, and I would definitely say this is horror. It doesn't really have a lot of other elements in it besides horror. It's basically about this guy who gets into a construction accident. He's like a construction worker, and he gets into an accident, and he can't work anymore, and he kind of moves to Florida to live in this place called Doom a Key, in this house. Honestly, this book kind of reminds me, it has a lot of similar elements to Bag of Bones, like with the weird house and everything, but it also has a lot of really unique elements to it. For example, the main character kind of takes up painting, and throughout the book there's these little things before some of the parts that say like how to draw a picture, and there's a whole bunch of those scattered throughout these, and they're like these really interesting little add-ons to what you're reading. Basically it follows him while he's in Florida, basically trying to recover from his accident, and he's kind of like really angry at a lot of stuff. His wife has left him, and he just picks up painting and drawing, and he lives in this house, and it's got a lot of really different elements to it. So certain parts of this were iffy for me. The ending was really iffy for me, but it definitely has a lot of really scary stuff going on in it. It's not like The Shining scary, but it is still a really good horror book. This next book is a massive one. It's called Under the Dome. It is way over 1,000 pages. It is a TV show right now that I haven't watched. I don't really watch TV at all, but this book is insane. I wouldn't call this book horror at all. I honestly don't know what genre to put this book in. It's just freaking crazy. It has some elements of sci-fi. It's just really weird. Basically, this town just suddenly gets cut off from everybody. A giant dome is just suddenly appears out of nowhere, and like at the very beginning, when the dome just like appears, it like cuts a woodchuck like clean in half. So the dome is just like impenetrable, and you can't get through it, and no one can get into it, and it's crazy. It has so many characters in it. Basically the entire town is a part of the story, and you learn about all of the characters in the town pretty much, and there's just like this big play for power and what they're going to do, and I guess I would say it's kind of like thrillery, but also kind of dramatic. It's like basically one huge drama of who gets the power, what are they going to do, what's going to happen to them. They're obviously worried about running out of food and stuff. I'm not sure who I would recommend this book to. All I can say is that if you like a lot of characters, a really big dramatic cast of characters, then I would definitely suggest you read this. The ending is a really, really, really weird, but honestly, the journey of reading the book and reading this massive thing and just following the story honestly doesn't even really make what the ending is matter that much. I mean, obviously the ending matters, but the journey of reading this is just one big epic thing that makes everything worthwhile when you finish it. It's really well written. All of the characters are so well characterized. All of them are so unique. They're all different from each other. And that's amazing considering how many people are in this town and how many people he writes about in this town. And it's really great. It's really, really ambitious. And it's something that he had apparently been working on in his head since even before he had gotten published. But he just never wanted to do it until he could feel like he could do it in the right way, and I feel like he definitely did it in the right way in this. And if reading gigantic, massive books like this isn't necessarily your thing, then maybe you should check out the TV show. I have thought about checking out the TV show, and it's not that I don't want to watch it necessarily, it's just that I don't really watch much TV at all in the first place. So the next book is one that I just cannot recommend highly enough. This is one of my favorite books by him also. This is called 11/22/63. It was published just in 2011, 2011, and this is such a great book. This is not horror either. This has so many different elements to it. It deals with time travel, but it's a really, really, really unique time travel type of idea. Basically, the idea is that every time you go back is the first time. So you go back in time, you do a whole bunch of stuff, you stay there for a while, you do a whole bunch of stuff, and you go back to the present. If you decided to go back in time, you would go back to the exact same day every single time, and everything that you did before would be erased, and you have to start all over again. And basically, that's like the number one rule, is that every time you go back is the first time. Except when you go back, there's these like really strange happenings that happen like right around the place where the main character goes back in time, but he never really like thinks about it. He just kind of goes off and does the things he wants to do, and he kind of puts it at the back of his head what the consequences of going back in time are, and at the same time the audience, the reader, kind of puts it at the back of their head too, and just kind of follows along with the story and gets enthralled with the story. And it's a really interesting time travel idea, while at the same time having so much other stuff going on for it, which is like historical fiction, and it takes place in the 60s. Basically, when you go back in time, you always end up on this one day in 1961, I believe, and the guy who finds the little portal back in time. He finds it in the back closet of his like burger restaurant. His name is Al, and he kind of uses it to go back and get cheap meat, and also to learn a lot about tragic events that happen around the time. There's one tragic event that happens that he feels like he can go back and stop, and that is the JFK assassination. So he goes back in time and learns all the stuff about Lee Harvey Oswald and about his life and stuff. But Al, he's getting old and he just can't do it anymore because he has cancer. So he asks a character named Jake to go back in time for him. Jake is a teacher and a writer, and he eventually does decide to go back in time to do what Al wants him to do, to stop the JFK assassination. But obviously there's a whole bunch of controversy surrounding who actually was responsible for the JFK assassination. He has to basically learn what actual events that happened on the day are, and he has to stay there for like 2 years because he goes back to 1961 instead of 1963, which is when the assassination actually happens. So he stays there for 2 years and a whole bunch of stuff happens to him. He like becomes a teacher at this school, and it's basically just all the stuff happens back in time. And I love historical fiction a lot. If you like historical fiction and things to do with political fiction, and even if you don't, I really suggest you read this book. This book is extremely enjoyable all around. It is really easy to get through. It is really inspiring at some parts. It has a lot of romance elements to it. It has a lot of really nice like feel-good elements to it within Jake's life as he stays there for 2 years, but at the same time deals with all of the crazy stuff that Jake is dealing with on the side, like the JFK stuff. And it's got a whole lot of stuff going on. It's got a whole lot of genres packed into one, and this is one of the books that I would just recommend to literally anyone. If you're looking for a Stephen King book to pick up and don't know if you like horror, don't know if you would be that into his writing, pick up this book and see what you feel about it, because I genuinely think that this is one of his best books, and like I said, I would recommend it to anyone. The next one just came out last year, 2013, and it's a very short one. It's called Joyland. This is also not really necessarily a horror book. I would say it's kind of like a mystery, but it's also more of a coming-of-age tale of this teenage guy. He's like a college student, and he is going through this kind of bad breakup with his longtime girlfriend, and he has to go to this amusement park called Joyland in North Carolina to make money one summer, and he kind of becomes part of this little amusement park. He becomes a part of the lifestyle there. He becomes one of them, like one of the people that work at this amusement park, and he's like accepted into their group. And at the same time there's like this mystery surrounding this one ride where this girl died, and so it's got some mystery elements to it. And this is another book that I would just say a lot of people, regardless of what genre it is, would like. This is another book that I would recommend to people who like YA fiction. If you're looking to get into Stephen King and you usually read YA stuff, read Joyland, because it really is like a coming of age book, and I really think people in like their late teens / early 20s would really enjoy this. And the little bit of mystery that's added to it is also really nice, and it's just also really, really well written, and it's a really, really quick read. There isn't a slow part in this book, and there are some funny parts. The characters are all just really great. All the people that work at the amusement park are really great characters. The main character is a really great character, and I just really, really have to recommend this to those that would sound interesting too. The last novel that I'm going to talk about is Dr. Sleep, which just came out this past year, 2013 also. This is the sequel to The Shining, and I actually just did a full review on this book, and honestly I'm going to go ahead and suggest you go watch the Dr. Sleep review, the full video review that I just posted like a couple days ago. I don't really want to go too much into this. I'm just going to say that it is a really great sequel to The Shining. If you have not read this and you have read The Shining, definitely read this. If you have not read The Shining, don't read this. If you've seen the movie for The Shining but have not read the book, don't read this. Go read The Shining and then read this. This is a really great sequel. It's not as horror-y as I thought it would be, and it's not as horror-y as The Shining, but it is a really great continuation of The Shining, featuring the little boy from The Shining all grown up, and we get to see what he's like as an adult and what he does with his life. And this is just a really great book with this really like great group of villains called the True Knot, and another really great character with The Shining called Abra. Anyway, I definitely say to go check out my full video review on Dr. Sleep to get a little bit more info about it. So that is the end of the list of novels, except for the Dark Tower series, which I said I would talk about separately. I have read 5 of the 8 books in the Dark Tower series. The first one is called The Gunslinger, the second one is called The Drawing of the Three, the third one is called The Wastelands, the fourth one is called Wizard in Glass, the fifth one is called The Wolves of the Kala, the sixth one is called Song of Susanna, and the 7th one is called The Dark Tower. And the 8th one, which just came out in 2012, kind of like an in-between novel. I think it goes in between the 6th and the 7th one. It's called The Wind Through the Keyhole. And I've only read the first 5 up to The Wolves of the Kala, not for any particular reason. It's a very big series. There's a lot of stuff going on in it. I stopped reading it a few years ago. I don't remember exactly why I did it. It wasn't because I wasn't enjoying it. I think it was because of school reasons that I just had to put it down for a while. Honestly, if I tried to read the last few books in the series, I'd want to reread the entire series over again, and I think I might actually try to do that this year. This book series is just one giant epic. I mentioned how Stephen King kind of talked about how he wanted to do something kind of inspired by The Lord of the Rings with The Stand, but he didn't really do that much with The Stand, but with this he did. This is one epic, like high fantasy type of book series, and if you're into that type of thing, high fantasy, then I would definitely suggest you read this series. But this series, it starts off kind of like a western. The first book, The Gunslinger, has a lot of elements of western in it. The first book is really, really short and is really, really easy to get through really fast, and kind of tells you about a little bit about what is going on. The main character's name is Roland, and he is like the last gunslinger in this world, and a gunslinger in this world is kind of like a knight. It's like this really high-ranking thing that not a lot of people are, and he is the last one of them. And this series really mixes together so many different genres, but like I said, the main genre above all of it is fantasy. It takes place in this world called Midworld, which has a lot of elements of like the Old West, but magical. And this world is kind of like falling apart, and Roland is setting off to look for this thing called the Dark Tower, which is kind of like said to be the, for lack of better explanation, and because I haven't finished the series and I don't want to give too much away of what I do know, even though I don't know a whole lot because I haven't reached the end, the Dark Tower is kind of said to be like the center of like the universe or something. It's just like this big ultimate thing that he's set out to find, and he needs lots of help, and he meets lots of people that try to stop him. There's lots of antagonists, there's lots of people that join him on his journey, and there's a whole lot of things that happen in the story. I don't want to give anything away. All I can really say is that if you like fantasy, this is a series that you need to read. It's considered to be Stephen King's like magnum opus, his like big work, and it is a really big, massive work that he just pours himself into. And I can't believe I haven't finished the series yet. I really, really need to, and I really want to do that this year. And I think I might try to do that sometime like at the beginning of the summer, maybe like at the beginning of June. If anyone is interested in like doing a read along with me of the entire series from beginning to end, I would be totally into that. That might inspire me to go ahead and go through with this, and I hope it would inspire some other people to pick up the series and read it all the way through as well. Anyway, I'm gonna go into now his collections of short stories and novellas. The very first collection of short stories that he released was released in 1978, just after The Shining was released. It's called Night Shift, and this is a book filled with lots of little horror stories. Here, I'll show it to you. See, it's not that big, but it has a lot of little short stories in it. And something I have to say is that if you don't know if you'd like Stephen King's writing, if you don't know if you liked his brand of horror, read his short stories. His short stories are great. He is a great short story person. He is like a master of short fiction because he has written so many of them, and you can get a pretty good feel for what his writing style is in his short stories, but without the commitment of a really long novel. And this short story collection in particular has some really great horror stories in it. For one example is The Children of the Corn, which was made into a movie that I actually kind of like, and that story is just well known, and there's a lot of other really great horror short stories in this as well. The second one I'm going to talk about is actually a collection of 4 novellas. It was published in 1982 and it's called Different Seasons. This is a great little book because it's a lot different from his other stuff, especially at the time. He hadn't really published anything like this yet. These stories are not horror stories, not really, they're more drama. In fact, I'll give you 2 examples. This book contains the novellas that were the basis of 2 pretty well-known movies. The first one, the movie is called Stand By Me. In this book, it's called The Body. But Stand By Me is a really great movie. If you've seen that, you should definitely read the novella. And then another really, really famous movie that is in this is The Shawshank Redemption. In this, it's called Rita Hayworth and The Shawshank Redemption. There are a few differences between the novella and the movie, but if you've seen the movie, you should definitely check this out. If you like that style of storytelling from Stand By Me and The Shawshank Redemption, you should definitely check out this book, because there are 2 other really great novellas in this as well that aren't horror, that are a different kind of storytelling than what you might be used to in Stephen King works. The next one is called Skeleton Crew. This is another collection of short horror stories. The introduction in this book is one of my favorite introductions in any book ever. Stephen King, when he's just talking as himself, has a really great witty voice, and it's just, he uses some really great analogies to describe the differences between short fiction and long fiction, like novels. And Skeleton Crew is a collection of horror stories that I would definitely recommend you check out. The next one that I'm going to talk about is a collection of 4 horror novellas called 4 Past Midnight. This is the book that contains the novella Secret Window. It's actually called Secret Window, Secret Garden, but the movie that just came out a few years ago with Johnny Depp is called Secret Window. These novellas are a little bit longer than the novellas that are in different seasons. So if you're like looking for some Stephen King horror that is not necessarily a really long book or a really short story, you want something in between, definitely check this out. This has got 4 really great horror stories in it. The next book is actually my favorite collection of short stories. Once again, these are pretty much all horror short stories. It's called Nightmares and Dreamscapes. It looks long, but that's because there's a ton of stories, and some of them are really short, some of them are a lot longer, but not quite long enough to be novellas. The next collection of short stories is called Just After Sunset. It was just released in 2008, which is quite a big jump from Nightmares and Dreamscapes, which was published in 1993. I think there are a couple other collections in between those that I have not read yet, but Just After Sunset actually doesn't have quite as many stories as the other books do. It's not that big, and each story isn't very long. There's 14 short stories in this. If you're looking for something more recent that's horror-ish, that also have a little bit of drama and thriller thrown in as well, just quick little stories, I definitely suggest you check this one out. And the last collection of novellas, which was just published in 2010, I'm going to talk about, is called Full Dark, No Stars. This book is kind of what the title suggests, full dark. These are really dark novellas. Like, Stephen King just kind of didn't hold back at all when he wrote these. They're dark. And the last 2 books I'm going to talk about are the nonfiction books. This one is called Danse Macabre. This is a book all about horror. It was written in 1981, and it's basically all about how horror film, horror books, horror in comics, and horror on the radio even have influenced popular culture. He separates different kinds of horror into different categories. Like, the lowest category is like gross out horror. Basically talks about what the best kinds of horror are and how it affects people, why people make horror things like horror books and horror films, what the appeal of it is. He talks about all that type of stuff. So if you're a big fan of horror, you should definitely check this out. Okay, so I only have one more book to talk about, which is good because my light is basically completely gone. The last book, which was published in the year 2000, is On Writing, which I've talked about several times before in several of my other videos. This is one of the best books you could possibly read as a writer. It's part like autobiography on Stephen King, where he talks about his struggles as a writer and him making it as a writer, and then his writing tips. It is a really quick read. I can usually read this in like a day because it is so inspiring if you're a writer. The things he says are just so great. He gives you some really great tips and some really great advice. And the story of his life that he tells is just really inspiring as well. And if you're a writer, I can't recommend this book enough. Alright, so that's it for the books that he's had published. Except for 2. He has 2 books that are supposed to be coming out this year. The first one is coming out in June, and it is called Mr. Mercedes. It's supposed to be like a hard-boiled detective book about this detective who is being taunted by a murderer. It sounds really interesting. I don't know too much about it, and I can't really say too much about it. All I know is that I'm definitely going to be getting it when it comes out. The second book comes out in November, and it's called Revival. It doesn't have a cover yet. It's basically described as being about music, addiction, religious fanaticism, and every nightmare we have ever had about death. It's supposed to be dark, dramatic, and intense. And I'm really excited for both of those books. I wanted to say a quick thing about what makes me pick up Stephen King book over another Stephen King book, like why I've read the ones that I have over other ones. Like, if I didn't talk about it in this video, then I haven't read it yet. And there are some big ones that I haven't read yet that probably surprise people, like Pet Sematary, It, Cujo, Christine, and stuff like that, and the Bachman books, and the Dark Tower series. But when I pick a Stephen King book, it's usually because I'm buying it from a bookstore. Every single bookstore you go to the place where Stephen King books will be, and there's just all the bookstores that you go to will have different Stephen King books there. None of them have the same books, unless they're like the newer ones. They all have the newer ones, but of the older ones, it's all really scattered and really random sometimes. And usually when I go to a bookstore, I will buy a Stephen King book, one that I haven't read yet, from the random scatterings of his old works. Eventually I am going to read every single book by Stephen King, It's just that's the kind of the process I go through. I go to a bookstore, see which books they have at the bookstore, and just pick whichever one I just want to grab at that moment. Anyway, my light is pretty much completely gone now. I really hope this video wasn't too long. If you got this far, then thank you for watching. I really hope you found something that you would like to read by Stephen King. At least one thing would be great. If you have any questions at all, if you have anything to add to what I've said, like I said, I'm not a Stephen King expert. I probably missed some things. And if you have any recommendations for Stephen King books you think people should read, leave it in the comments. Leave questions in the comments. Subscribe if you want to see more. Let me know if you've found something in this that you're going to read. Let me know what you've decided to read, if you have decided to read something by him. Let me know what your favorite things by him are. Give me some suggestions maybe for things that I haven't read yet by him. And yeah, I just thank you guys so much for watching. I'm going to go now, and I'll see you very soon.